Hello and what's up, political peeps? Per usual, I'm your host Arif Kapoor, and I welcome you back to the GeoPolitical for another solo-style episode. I know we've been doing a lot of interviews with the school year. I've been pretty busy, but I'm not in my shirt and tie today. Excited to talk to you guys more about political happenings, get into the nitty-gritty, sometimes lesser talked about intricacies of Congress, etc. Today, I want to talk to you guys about President Trump's widely publicized Big Beautiful Bill Act. He's working with Senate and House GOP members to get this through and essentially fulfill his campaign promises and what he wrote on his agenda when running for office prior to November. It hasn't been an easy process for either Speaker Johnson, who's spearheading the effort to get this MAGA bill through on the House side, nor Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who's getting the bill through on the Senate side. But they're both going through a process called reconciliation, because to pass a normal bill through the Senate, it would require a supermajority of 60 votes, which is 3/5 of the 100 people in the Senate, to invoke cloture and prevent a filibuster, which is when somebody can draw out debate to essentially block or delay the passage of a bill. Now, the reconciliation process doesn't require that 60 votes for cloture. It only requires a simple majority of the duly elected United States senators. So that's only 51 senators would have to vote for this reconciliation bill and would pass. But the thing about reconciliation, there is something called the Byrd Rule, which is named after Senator Robert Byrd and essentially restricts what can be included in a reconciliation package. Reconciliation packages are supposed to simply be reconciling 2 years' money and 2 years of a budget. So they codify some of President Trump's executive orders when he was talking about, putting more ICE agents in cities. Yes, he can do that, but only through the reconciliation process can we allocate more money to, say, for example, hire ICE agents. Or with GOP representatives and senators have included provisions relating to Medicaid, not giving Medicaid to illegals, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, right? So there's a couple different aspects that the GOP is putting into this bill that will overall fulfill President Trump's economic agenda. But the Byrd Rule is a huge check, because you have to think about it. Who decides if something follows the Byrd Rule, and who will ultimately determine if something can be included in this reconciliation bill, which is going to be extremely consequential to the next 10 years, if not longer, for the United States of America? Well, that's the Senate Parliamentarian. And you may be asking, who is the Senate Parliamentarian? And the Senate Parliamentarian is simply a Senate staffer, not Senate approved, not part of the judicial branch, not another branch of government to check the United States Senate, but just a Senate staffer that essentially advises the presiding officer of the Senate. The presiding officer is officially the Vice President of the United States, but he serves that in a ceremonial role. So normally, the presiding officer is a junior senator when it's not the president pro tempore of the United States Senate. When a provision is brought to the floor concerning the reconciliation package, it is up to the presiding officer to decide whether or not to allow that in the bill. But the presiding officer, of course, doesn't know all the different Senate rules, etc. So that's what the parliamentarian role is. They sit next to the president of the Senate on the podium, and essentially, if there's ever a policy question or something of this nature pertaining to reconciliation, they will advise the presiding officer of the United States Senate, the person who's holding the gavel in the front of the room, to whether or not to say yes to this or no. Now, technically, the power lies on the presiding officer, but it is common practice for in terms of reconciliation, to just go with whatever the parliamentarian's ruling is. Now, let's come back to the Big Beautiful Bill. It passed the House with a very, very thin margin, 215 to 214 on May 22nd. Why? Because certain hardliner Republicans, much farther right, but also very what we would call fiscal hawks, stood against this bill because it increases the debt ceiling and the deficit. And most Republicans want President Trump's promise to stop eating into the debt. But MAGA Republicans, including Mike Johnson and the rest of the House GOP leadership, is that although, yes, this bill does increase the deficit, it also does things that save money, such as, not giving Medicaid to illegals and other provisions that will overall, in their eyes, against what the Congressional Budget Office is saying, since they predicted that this will, yes, increase the deficit more than the stuff like Medicaid to illegals will help. So that's the argument between the Republican Party, and that's why this bill passed the House with such a narrow margin when it went to the Senate. The Senate's been working on it for just over a month now, and they've made a lot of changes. So even once this passes the Senate, it has to go back to Mike Johnson in the House. They have to form a conference committee. But anyways, so our current parliamentarian serving since 2012, Elizabeth MacDonough, essentially ruled that some of the cuts to giving Medicaid to illegals and a couple of the other provisions within the bill violate the Byrd Rule. They're not strictly related to economics and finance, so they have to be removed from the bill and either put into another bill or if reworded. I'll get into the solutions for how the GOP can override her ruling in just a few minutes. Now, number one, of course, it's up to the presiding officer whether something falls into the bill or not. The thing is, there's very limited historical precedent for violating the parliamentarian. Then we can also go through the Senate majority, which could essentially vote to overrule her ruling about the Byrd Rule. Again, very little historical precedent. Then you could split the provision into a regular bill, but like I mentioned, most bills require a 60-vote cloture number to pass in the voting stage of the United States Senate. And with the Senate GOP having only 53 votes in such a polarizing landscape where you're unlikely to get any Democratic votes, reconciliation is the only option. Then, of course, you could fire the parliamentarian because she serves at the discretion of the majority leader, which is John Thune in this situation. But those four options, like I mentioned, very little historical precedent, are very unlikely to happen because most senators, of course, there's the senators like Tommy Tuberville, etc. from Alabama, who are younger and are more willing to, break norms, including maybe getting rid of the parliamentarian, etc. Because ultimately, the Senate operates with a ton of archaic processes, such as even the filibuster. It's been brought up to go nuclear mode and essentially remove the filibuster. But many senators, including Majority Leader John Thune, Senator Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, want to respect the institution. And also, they think very highly of themselves, honestly. As the upper house, they think that it's the house for this philosophical debate, and there should be unlimited debate. So we need the filibuster, and we should be able to, argue back and forth for as long as we want, and we're more elite than the House of Representatives. But with these rules, like the parliamentarians' ruling and the filibuster, which doesn't allow much big change to happen, we won't see change. My view on this is that, yes, it is important to have both sides represented, and most Republicans don't want to fully go, even though it only takes 50 votes to remove the filibuster. When the filibuster is 60 votes, most Republicans don't want to remove the filibuster because that would set a precedent for when they ultimately lose the majority in the United States Senate for them to use the filibuster. And last year, when the Senate Democrats had the majority, the filibuster helped them since they didn't have 60 votes. It helped the Republicans block tons and tons of measures that would have been extremely detrimental to the Republican cause under the Biden presidency. Now, because of this, we don't see change. I honestly think that removing the filibuster, although the minority party wouldn't have as much representation, it's the only way we can change. We haven't had any big legislation since the Obama era, when we passed the Obamacare, which actually was originally supposed to be in the form of reconciliation, not in the form of reconciliation. We had a ton of different provisions of Barack Obama. Then Senator Ted Kennedy, a Democrat, died. We had a special election in Massachusetts. A Republican was elected. So then Republicans had 41 votes. Democrats only had 59. They couldn't pass it as a regular bill. They couldn't pass cloture. So suddenly he had to rewrite the whole bill, transfer it over into the form of reconciliation so he could get 50 votes. So these old practices save both parties on the occasion. For example, this practice is saving the Democrats on this side in terms of the big, beautiful bill, it saved the Republicans on acts like such as Obamacare, etc. So neither party's leadership really wants to get rid of the parliamentarian or the filibuster because they have a deep respect for the institution. Unfortunately, that means stuff doesn't oftentimes get done. So what the Senate leader, John Thune, is going to go through with as of the morning of Friday, June 27th, he wants to rewrite the provision because oftentimes with reconciliations happen way more times than overriding the presiding officer. That the last time that happened was when Gerald Ford did that in 2001 because she argued that Social Security cuts weren't to be included in the reconciliation bill. Anyways, he wants to rewrite the bill along with Senate leadership and the other committees, specifically on the parts that were removed to make them more passable with the Byrd Rule. This is something that's happened many times. It's likely that this will happen, but it is continuously drawing out the passage of this bill. And the Senate and House both still have a target to get this bill passed by July 4th, to have it on the president's desk, which means we will be eating into the recess. But of course, they have to reconvene in a conference committees because they have to pass the same version of the reconciliation bill to even get it on the president's desk for his signature. Essentially, John Thune is saying that because they have to rewrite the bill, it looks like we're going to be skipping at least the beginning part of the July 4th recess in the United States Senate. And if you think about it, this is all pretty crazy. The Senate staffer, not Senate approved, literally holds the cards in President Trump's agenda. I think that to have any change in the United States and for reform, we need to be gone with these archaic practices. At least, make a committee, make a bipartisan committee that can rule whether or not stuff, abides by the Byrd Rule. There's so many different options, but with one person holding the cards, it is hard to have change with things like the filibuster. And honestly, oftentimes, what Elon Musk was going in with the federal government to do was facilitate change and go into the bureaucracy that had been brewing for so many years because there was no check, there was no different opinion. So getting new people involved, that's why getting young people involved in politics is important, because it really leads to change and development. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it doesn't really apply to this realm of the world, because it essentially is always broke actually, and there's always fixing to do, because society is constantly developing. So I think it's very important that we acknowledge the archaic practices of the Senate. And then there's always Elisa Murkowski's, who are holdouts, who are like, I have respect for my institution. And then there's the younger senators who are ready to make change happen. So essentially, big crazy times in America. Foreign affairs. Check out my YouTube channel. Talk about Iran on the Shorts page. I'm posting on LinkedIn. Follow me on there, R of A Kapoor. Substack, some occasional posts. This is more solo episodes I advertise on LinkedIn, sometimes even Substack. So please do check that out at your earliest convenience on my different social media platforms. I hope you found this enriching concerning the role of the parliamentarian of the United States Senate and how she's blocking President Trump's agenda from passing. Honestly, I think it's pretty likely that John Thune will be able to rewrite this. He's been doing this for long enough, and he has the advice of many other United States senators, since the average age of the United States senator is some 172 years old. No, in reality, it's around 65, but this will most likely get passed. And although the goal was to have it come to the floor for a vote of the entire Senate today, I don't think that's likely. We probably will be going into the weekend and for the final provisions, because we have to cater to every holdout. The people who don't want less Medicaid cuts because they're afraid that the Democrats have been pushing against Medicaid cuts within the Republican caucus. And there's the Republicans who want, more of the, less raising of the debt ceiling, because they're afraid that even though we're working these things like no Medicaid to illegals, etc., first of all, what will we compromise on those? Since those were the main things that the main things that win our money, that we get our money back with, were compromised by the Byrd Rule in yesterday's ruling. So those further right Republicans are concerned about that. Let's see how this all plays out. I'll be updating definitely when the bill passes the Senate. It has to go to the House and a conference committee, pass both chambers, send it to the president's desk. Political peeps, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. You guys know the drill. I'm your host, Ara Kapoor. Peace out, political peeps.